I know some of the students on the call will know you because they had the opportunity to be in a workshop you ran that focuses on success beyond the classroom. And when you invited guests into SBC, you gave them 5 minutes to basically tell their entire career path. So we're going to give you a bigger challenge. We're going to give you 3 minutes. And by the way, Upkar has said he's got his timer set. 3 minutes to give students your career path. So whenever you want to start, please do.
Thanks, Nancy. I think I might focus on the career path as it relates to things that the students can't look up if they're interested. So, and just maybe focus on that, but maybe in three different dimensions. The chronology dimension is really went to school at Waterloo, through the School of Accounting and Finance, master's, and then KPMG, Nortel Networks, which is a big telecom provider, to a global real estate company called Olympia, New York, to Reichman International, Trizec, Onyx, another company that's in the technology space, battery technology, and then did a bunch of stuff through my own company called Illumina Partners in terms of operations, finance, and advisory. So that's sort of the very simple chronology. But I think the more important lens for the students today might be more of a flexural lens. And I really went into industry post KPMG in working in the accounting area, really for Nortel, so the analytical side, in the financial reporting, analysis, reporting, budgeting area. And from there, moved more into the financial analysis to the finance side, from there into more M&A type of roles, operations, treasury, and other stuff. And then more into the leadership side, which included HR, strategy, and things like that. So that would give some students a sense of how I went to more of the more senior roles over my lifetime. And then maybe some other dimensions that students might be interested in is that if you look at my background, it has moved from being transactional, I do large financing, large acquisitions, dispositions, mergers, et cetera, into more operational and strategic. It's been involved with public organizations like Trizec, a public company, where I was investor relations, to private companies like O&Y and Reichman International, small companies and large, so, multi-billion-dollar companies as well as really small companies. It's involved Canadian companies, Mexican, American, global companies as well. And it's really involved now the entire gamut of startup to mature in situations of growth and rapid growth to situations of decline. And then the last couple of sort of, fractals I'd mentioned are, it's gone from being entrepreneurial to being established, and the roles that I've taken have involved both of those and across many, many different industries and sectors. And so just to close off that really quick dimension, I'd say sort of the question I get is why those opportunities? Why did you make those changes? I think I've been really driven by three main criteria. The first one was, would I have a chance to work with great people? Would I have a chance to really push my boundaries in terms of learning? And the third one was, can I make an impact? And that's really driven the choices I've made in terms of career. And the last one has really been, can I work with organizations that are values aligned, where I feel like their actions and behaviors embody or are consistent with mine? And that's moved me into some of the organizations or my own organization over time. I wish I could tell you that if you look at my board involvement, it was done with a very keen, forward-looking, proactive lens, but it was not. And so I'll talk about the first board role. A friend of mine that I had worked with was on a board of the McMichael Canadian Art Collection. It's a gallery focused on Group of Seven Art, just north of Toronto in Kleinburg. And he said, would you like to come and join the board? I said, wow, that's really interesting. Haven't done it before. That sounds cool. So, in 2008, I joined that board. I joined that board and spent a couple of years learning how a board works, what the dynamics are, what kind of things I focus on, and really getting myself a little bit more knowledgeable. And then in 2010, I got a call from the ministry, the government of Ontario. So this organization is an agency of the government of Ontario under Ministry of Culture, Tourism, and Sport. And they said, we just want to let you know that we're no longer going to renew the chair's position going forward, even though she's been there for the last 8 years. And we've talked to all the board members that are remaining, and they've decided that you should be chair. And I said, I don't know anything about that. What does that mean? And they said, well, you'll figure it out. And I said, no. And so then they phoned me back and said, well, we've gone again, and they really think you should be chair. And so I reluctantly accepted that role, not knowing very much about what a chair is, having 2 years of governance under my belt, on the condition that they would allow me to have greater input on who I could bring on the board, which had been a real problem for that organization. So I walked into a role where I became chair. A lot of the board members weren't renewed. We had the potential to have 23 board members. We were down to, I think, 9 board members because they had all not been renewed, including the chair whose term had not been renewed. And so I sort of said, okay, so what does this chair role look like? What am I supposed to do? I was told there are really 3 things that a chair needs to focus and a board needs to focus on. One is really stewardship of the asset. The second is effective performance. And the third is just from a risk and compliance standpoint. And the last sort of related to all those is effective performance of the CEO. And so I said, okay, well, let me figure that out. Start with the last one. So said, okay, let me talk about the performance of the CEO. When's the last time we did a performance appraisal to get a sense of how the CEO is doing? And the answer was, I think the last time was 14 years ago. And so maybe we should do one. That would be a good idea, I think. So we did a 360-degree where we interviewed the people that he reports to, the board he reports to, his peers and his subordinates. And we got to 360, and there was a resounding agreement amongst the board that the CEO was not doing an effective job. So I was appointed in April. By June 10th, we're having a meeting, and the meeting involves, should we terminate the CEO? And for those of you who have board experience, the biggest decision you'll probably ever make is, should you hire or should you fire the CEO? And so we decided to part ways with the CEO, and we had to convince the ministry that this was the right thing to do. So that was getting thrown into the fire in a very, very significant way very early on. And what I came to realize is that what we had thought was good governance under the previous chair was anything but good governance. It was really where the separation between a chair and the CEO was non-existent. The chair acted like the CEO, did not really advise the board of issues, risks, challenges, performance, and so forth. And so the board had gone along just, basically nodding their heads, saying, yes, things were fine when things really were not fine. And so as I sort of got into that, I had to become really, really knowledgeable pretty quick, because now we needed to terminate the CEO, negotiate that, hire a new CEO. And over the course of that role, which ended up being about 8 years in total, 6 years as chair, I realized that there was so much more to how boards were working to improve the effectiveness of boards in a meaningful way. Some of the things we implemented at that board, of a budget of $7 million and a small organization of 50 people, are actually better than what I've seen in many of the boards that are 10, 20, 100 times our size. And I'm just going to give you a funny example of that. 6 years, about 5 years after becoming chair, doing a lot of work in stabilizing the organization, hiring a new CEO, getting a lot more funding, revamping the board, increasing the engagement effectiveness. I went to the ministry and said, I just want to let you know that I'm going to step down next year. And they looked at me in this blank look and they said, why? They said, the only time someone steps down is 2 reasons. One is if they've done something wrong, they need to be kicked out, or if they die. And I don't think, I said, well, I'm not dying and I don't think I've done anything wrong, but this is good governance to have succession planning on a board. So we went through that process and I said, well, give me some ideas as to how bigger organizations have done that. And the bigger organizations in our world, well, the Art Gallery of Ontario, Royal Ontario Museum, Ontario Science Centre, they're all going through leadership transitions at the board level. And they said, don't know, they don't have a plan. I said, but that can't be right. They're much bigger. They said, no. Then they said, can you go in and talk to them about that? Because you would be really effective in giving them a proper plan that I had tabled for the cycle. So again, it was really a case of learning trial by fire, trying to read as much as I could, learn from peers, talk to other chairs. And then what I decided to do was go back and get an education in proper governance by getting my ICD designation, which stands for Independent Corporate Director, to really bolster my experiential knowledge with real practical, theoretical, best practices in the area to bolster our performance at the board level. So that was my introduction to the McMichael. After that experience, I realized that I actually really enjoyed being at a strategic level, understanding the role of a board was not to do, but to advise, creating this separation between the chair of the board and the actual leadership team. And our role was really to support the leadership team achieve the strategic goals of an organization in the ways that I've described. Different companies have different needs at different times in terms of their stage and evolution. And therefore, there sometimes isn't a reflection of what's relevant and beneficial for an organization and what kind of board members should it actually bring on And so just give you an example where a startup's very different from an established organization. They're looking for networks and concepts. They're looking for input on different business models, or they're looking for what segments of the market they should tackle and so forth. That's very different than an established organization in many ways. And so one needs to be really conscious of ensuring that the board fits the needs and priorities of the organization over the next 3 to 5 years, as opposed to is a board because you want a big name on that board. In fact, what I would say is that some of the boards with the biggest names are actually the most dysfunctional. And we can talk about some of the reasons why that is. But it's actually not engaging and leveraging the talent and expertise that you need in order to advance the business imperatives. And so I think that's sometimes one of the problems. So those are some of them. But coming back to your other question, the differences then are that the various boards, organizations and boards are at different levels of maturity in their thinking and understanding. The levels of formality are different. So sometimes smaller boards ends up being a very working board. To say, I'll give you an example on the Why Not Theater board, they want to invest more wisely. They asked for an investment policy statement. So I did that for them. Normally, because they don't have the resource to, or capacity or financial ability to go and hire someone to do that. Whereas in the bigger organizations, you would outsource that to a third party, as we would do at a BCIB, for example. And the level of complexity is quite different based on, again, the stage of the organization. So those are some of the things to think about in terms of, different needs dictated by different, could be sectors, different stages of evolution, really drive who's on the board, what they're focused on, how active they are, the frequency of engagement, and the type of engagement across those different organizations.
Given the fact businesses will change over time, is that one of the reasons why succession planning is important as they move through different stages and face different priorities?
Absolutely. That's one of the major reasons. The other major reason, and NC, we're seeing it in some of the regulation that's coming out, especially in Europe, that if a board, especially if you're supposed to be providing an independent view of things, if you've been on a board for 25 years and you're so entrenched with management, and those are personal relationships, and you have the CEO over to your house for dinner every other Friday or Saturday, you could hardly be independent and provide critical judgment in terms of what an organization is doing. So there are new rules coming about. What constitutes independence? My view is that anything more than 6 or 7 years, you start to skew towards not being independent, not being objective, not being able to have the tough conversations. Some of the rules still say 9 years or 12 years, which I think is too long. So I would say different organizations need different things at different times. Let me just maybe answer your question with a very direct example. When I came into the McMichael, we needed really reestablishing a really solid foundation. So that meant a new CEO. It meant financial stability where we were able to get more funding. It meant more leadership and staff. It meant changes in corporate culture. It meant really focusing on what we were good at and how to engage different audiences. And so we did all that strategic, financial, foundational work. But at the end of the day, I am not an art collector who can talk to real donors with a sense of passion and excitement and relate to them. And what we needed was more fundraising and more significant art patrons to come to the McMichael. The person that we ended up choosing as a successor is an art collector, deals in those circles, goes to the auctions, understands the nuances of art and what it means, and therefore should be able to drive the organization building on that foundation in a much more meaningful way than I can. And so it comes back to a point that I'll probably refer to many, many times, is that we just have to think about our board role individually as being bigger than ourselves. We're there to serve the needs of an organization, not to serve ourselves, not to pad our resumes, not to get financial compensation, but to serve the needs of an organization in the best way possible. And sometimes the best way to serve is to step aside and allow people that have more talent, more capability, better suited to the needs of an organization to take the leadership reins and move forward from there.
Do you see a distinction between a small number of folks on a board versus a large number of folks on a board? Is a board size somehow impactful in terms of the efficacy of the board?
Adam, the short answer is absolutely yes. And the research actually bears that out. When you get to board sizes typically above 13 or 14, we start to lose the effectiveness. And the major reason is that, as we would all know it, I think if your students think about when you've got a group of 3 people in a team or a group project versus 13 people, you know that your level of commitment and engagement and your your ownership of I need to do this versus it'll get done by someone diminishes dramatically. The ability of a CEO or a leadership team to engage with 15 or 20 or 30 board members and say, Adam, I know you really bring this skill set, but then to say, Kelly, I know you bring this skill set. I really want to engage with you, or Matthew or Cynthia, to start engaging one-on-one with board members to get the value of their talent, their expertise, and their time. It's really hard when you get, big boards. And you also find that there's duplication in some of the expertise and the skill sets. So I think the sweet spot that we found worked best was somewhere in that 9 to 15. If you get smaller than that, if you've got committees of 2 or 3 people, it's not really that effective because, again, and I didn't say this, I should have said this, what you are striving for is actually diversity of thought and perspective to lead to better decision-making on the part of the board. That means you need more people, but too many people creates disengagement, and too few people does not give you the complete 360 view and the perspective you need to make better decisions.
How much time does it take to be a board member? And how do you find the time to participate at the necessary level on all the boards?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and something I'm going to say in fairness, I haven't done all that well. If I was to have this talk a year ago, I would have had 5 more boards. I've actually scaled my boards down by half. But the answer to your question is, if you want to make a commitment, then you need to follow through on the commitment, which means having read the materials, coming armed with insights, observations, being willing to engage, and that does require commitments. Just to give you a sense, at the Metrolinx board for a board meeting, we might have somewhere between 400 to 500 pages to read. At the VCIB board, if I look at all the committees and the board itself, 300 to 400 pages to read. Often those, we're getting better in terms of some of those pages being PowerPoint slides, but a lot of those are not PowerPoint slides. They are Word documents. They are detailed. They could be detailed financials. It's you're getting into, and from a risk standpoint, we've got a risk appetite framework and a risk that we have to drill down into many of those risks. There's a lot of detail. So the short answer is, if you're going to make a commitment, be very clear about what the level of commitment is, and be very clear that you've got the capacity and capability to do it. And I'm going to say it is really obvious to most people when board members come prepared and thoughtful, and when they don't, right? So if they're asking questions about stuff that's in the material, if they're not speaking at all or not engaged, or they can't respond to requests for feedback from leadership, it becomes really clear. And my view is, why waste everyone's time? If you can't be there and be present and be knowledgeable and thoughtful, don't make the commitment in the first place. But it is actually, you should expect to spend, and that number, Adam, in most cases, if you ask most big boards, and I'm part of this Deloitte group that Nancy would be aware of, where we have sort of bi-weekly calls on board issues at a more senior and a bigger level, the volume of work and the issues that arise are becoming more complex. And so the commitment on the part of board members is growing exponentially.
Did you say that some of the boards that you're aware of, big name boards, ones with good track records, are actually the most dysfunctional? Was that what you said? And could you elaborate on that, if so?
Sure. The elaboration, I think, would go to maybe another question that people have, which is, what are the skills of good board members? And the skills today might be quite different than 5 or 10 years ago. So I look at why are they dysfunctional? First of all, many of those boards are very well paid, and so the board members there have a financial and economic incentive to ensure the continuity of their appointment to that board because it's economically meaningful. Again, it goes to level of objectivity and independence, and who are you representing, and whether you would actually say to a CEO or encourage someone to change CEOs or make the right decisions for a company. So the amount of money and the extent or how your tenure go into not being objective or thoughtful enough about what's right for an organization. The second thing is that, and I'm going to make a generalization here, that the level of openness to someone who's been a CEO, and often these boards are former CEOs who joined boards, the level of openness to different ideas, the level of understanding of the factors that are affecting a company today. And now I'm thinking about things related to technology and cybersecurity. Their capacity and capability to actually learn about that, to be knowledgeable, to ask the right questions is diminishing. And yet those are the threats and risks that are emanating to the top of the boardroom agenda. The willingness to think about effectiveness in a way. And I'll just give you one really simple example. At the Michael, we instituted a performance appraisal process for the board members, where we asked each board member to self-assess. We asked each board member to assess all the other board members individually across 17 questions. And then we said to the board members, we have this feedback. It's anonymized. Would you like to receive that feedback as to what your other board members think about, whether you come prepared, whether you contribute, whether you're open to different ideas, and so forth? But I have not seen that. In fact, we are starting to do that on some of the boards I'm on, but I've literally not seen that on any boards because of the fear of people being perceived that they're not contributing. And so those conversations about, hey, Adam, you're actually not effective. Would you step down from the board? Very difficult when there are established relationships, economic incentives, and so forth. So boards tend to perpetuate members that actually may not provide value, may not be capable of being strategic or thoughtful about the current topical issues, but have history, have relationships and tenure, and therefore carry on. So that's my experience. That's both sitting on boards and looking at boards, because our world is looking at companies. And so we evaluate board composition, board dynamics in a very critical way for the investments we make at Raleigh Assets.
That is just a fascinating exercise of choosing whether you want peer feedback. I imagine it's quite telling those that actually say, yes, I do, versus those that don't. Just the selection probably tells you something. From your experience, what strategies do you use to engage with shareholders and ensure support if an activism campaign were to arise?
Yeah, no, great question. So Adam, we are, just for those that may not know, we are impact investors. That means when we're looking at companies, we are very much focused not just on ESG, which for us is a risk assessment or risk mitigation strategy to assess the risk inherent in a company, but also looking at outcomes. What does the company do that actually improves the world or the communities in which they operate? So we're very focused on using shareholder engagement through proxies and otherwise to engage with companies. I think the limitations we have are our size isn't significant enough to be some of the gorillas like the Engine Ones of the world that can create new board members at Exxon and others. So what strategies do we have? One is the fact that we're very true to our brand, and being impact investors actually creates a lot more impact. So organizations that realize that we're really true to that will take us more seriously than those are doing it for marketing or hype. That would be one. The second is there are many ways to collaborate and partner. So if you look at all the coalitions that are out there, we're part of probably about 5 or 6 ourselves related to climate change and others, but coalitions that come together on very specific strategies that actually, through strength in numbers, can really have an impact on those organizations. The third is the members of organizations like UNPRI, which stands for the UN Principles for Responsible Investing. Now, they have, I think, about 3,000 signatories now, and I think the assets under management of those signatories, and I may not get the number right, but it is in the 10 to $12 trillion, for example. So huge capacity to align with parties that think in a like-minded way and to really assert that. And so I think it's being part of campaigns and pledges, bringing people together, having an authentic and real voice, and then using both how we invest, the ways we invest, but also the more, we'll call it softer influence. We're not advocates of divestment strategies because we still think active engagement can lead to better results, because we want to see a shift to more responsible behavior as opposed to, basically extricate or carve out organizations that will continue to perpetuate and do bad things. And so we think that's the right strategy. So it's really through strength in numbers and be part of these campaigns that we think we can have some significant influence. But those are the attributes that I think that we focus on, which are the things related to critical thinking, emotional intelligence, collaboration, and things as basic as active listening really, really well. One of the reasons that you sort of got a sense that I've been asked to join many boards, one of the main reasons is actually I tend to listen well. I'm able to identify what I think the key issues are, and then to try to coalesce people into doing something about those issues. So when I think about the personal characteristics, just for a moment, Nancy, I'd say those attributes of being an active listener, having genuine commitment to an organization, believing in what they do or passion for their cause, their product, or their service. Um, Having an open mind, being curious about learning. So you have to have that openness, which really goes to having a growth mindset. And then having adaptability and agility to understand what you don't know and being open to developing the skills, the content, the subject matter expertise to really to bring that to enhance your effectiveness. And I'll just add one more thing, which is humility. I mean, the challenge for board members now is knowing all things and to being able to discharge their responsibilities effectively. It is a challenging task in a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world, but in a rapidly changing world for sure. So I think those are some of the qualitative characteristics. The openness to feedback, sharing, civil discourse, being respectful, and all those board dynamics that are absolutely critical. And then when we think about the more tangible, maybe the technical, I'll call them technical aspects, there are a number of ways. So PyCD is one, but there is now, especially under a COVID world, there's a ton of educational opportunities in specific areas. And the areas that are really rising to the surface that are top of mind are things that, again, all the students on this call would be very, very knowledgeable about. Technology issues, the pace of technological change, which has been compounded under COVID. And you've seen the stats from McKinsey that said, from a retail standpoint, we've taken what would have taken 5 to 7 years, and we transformed retail in the space of 6 to 9 months, right? That pace is incredible changes in fundamental ways we think about it. Supply chain shortages. What happens to your business models from supply chain? What happens when you've got the Colonial Pipeline situation, which shuts down businesses and the movement of oil and gas in an entire country as a result of cybersecurity and ransomware issues? How do we deal with that? What's our knowledge related to that? Obviously, there's issues that are rising to the surface now on ESG and climate. So there's a lot of regulations coming in through TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Disclosures coming in. A lot of regulations in Europe coming in related to disclosure of climate risks, which we're seeing more and more. That's a rapidly changing field. How do you get knowledgeable with that? And so there's a number of different, I'm going to say, service providers, education providers that can engage with the boards on that. We get training at the BCIB level on an ongoing basis. We have quarterly compliance requirements of getting training in the areas that are relevant to their business, which is anti-money laundering, cybersecurity, and so forth. So we get that training through third-party providers. And then the last thing is the informal networks. Find people that are really knowledgeable about those areas. Find courses, find webinars, find TED Talks, and all of the hosts of the podcasts and others that can give you exposure to those areas, people, thought leadership that are relevant to stay on top. And then this goes back now just to close it, to tie it to the first point. If you've got curiosity, if you've got openness to learning, and if you've got humility, you as a director owe it to yourself to go back to the organization and say, I don't know anything about this. I need some training. Can we bring an expert to educate the board? We don't even know what questions to ask or what risks that we are taking on or not taking on, or what the solutions are. How do we engage third parties to help us with that so we can be more effective in those? And so I think it relates to both content and personal attributes to make sure you're focused on, again, doing the right thing for the organization and not worrying about being perceived as being ignorant in certain areas. And by being ignorant, we just compound the problem. And that's where you get the horrific stories about questions that Adam and others would tell us about. Where was the board when this happened? Where was the board when XYZ disaster or catastrophe or something happened? And that's when the board, hiding behind a veil of, I don't know, so I'm afraid to ask, is often guilty of not being open enough to acknowledge its weaknesses in some way.
Will we see a trend towards younger professionals? And then related, what advice would you give to folks in terms of knowing when they're qualified for a more advanced position like a board position, yet not having the experience to draw from or to say, yeah, I am ready? When do they know? When do you know you're ready for that type of role? So package those together.
Sure. So what I would say, Adam, maybe dealing with the last one first, or maybe in combination of what I would say is, I don't think you ever know when you're ready. I certainly wasn't ready to become chair and sort of had to learn. And so that goes back to, the willingness to acknowledge that and to do the homework to get yourself prepared through a number of different channels. So I don't think you're ever ready. And if we wait till we're ready, keep in mind that what we've got is two things working at different speeds. We've got our level of development or growth or knowledge or expertise, and then we've got the world that we want to play in that's continuing to evolve and rapidly, probably more rapidly than we can evolve. At some point, like two whatever you call them, pistons that come together or circles that come together, at some point you have to make the leap and connect those two and say, okay, I will never be ready, but I do want to learn, and this provides me with an opportunity to learn and to contribute. So I'd say the first lesson for most people is start as early as you can. And the way to start is actually to find organizations that you feel somehow aligned with. And so if you believe, for example, it's a very, let's just take an example. Some people have a very personal experience with mental health or something like that, or an experience in their own families with some ailment or disease or some desire, or let's just say discrimination if you're someone who's BIPOC or something. If you've got issues or areas where you feel we need to make more progress in these areas, find organizations that you have the ability to be aligned with what they do. And this was a learning for us with Michael. We had a full-fledged, as you can imagine, as Nancy can imagine, with a full-fledged analytical framework for all the selection criteria for new trustees on our board. And then we forgot one, is why them with Michael? Why do you care about this organization versus any others? What is unique about us that gives you that sense of passion, that engagement, that willingness to say, I'm going to read 100 pages, I'm going to go out and talk to people, I'm going to advocate for this organization. So that level of passion or alignment is so important. And why is it important, to answer your other question, Adam, is it's important because generally, then you have a perspective that's of value to that organization because you know something about it, you care about it, you're willing to learn about it. And so now an organization is looking at, someone like Johnny who says, I want to join your board, and they're saying, what value can you bring to me? But to your first question is, Johnny can bring a perspective of knowledge about that issue area or that sector or something, a personal desire to learn more about that area, willingness to learn, and to answer that first question, a diversity of thought and perspective that many boards, the McMichael board was generally white at an average age of 55. By the time I was done, that had changed by 10 years, and we had a director and training program with an average age of 38 and 5 people that had gone through that program. But what were we looking for? Hey, I don't know what young people are thinking as it relates to how they want to engage with visual art in Canada. What's the best way to capture that? Is to bring those people, give them a seat at the table, have them involved in the discussion, and partner them up with someone who's got board experience so that they learn and benefit. And so it's really thinking about that to add diversity of thought, diversity of perspective in an area and an organization you feel passionate about, and to essentially be willing to learn and grow with that organization.